welcome to another weekly update. I hope you're doing well. Couple of things to talk about this week. Plus, conference season is starting really soon, starting from next week for me, in fact, so we'll talk about that. But first of all, the first thing I want to talk to you about is a new version of the SharePoint framework. So why do you care about this? Well, it's the new version 1.18, and it's got some updates in it for Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Viva, and SharePoint. So the SharePoint framework has really evolved into being an extensibility platform that, yes, is rooted in SharePoint, but actually impacts lots of other things as well. It often impacts Teams, it very much impacts Viva as well, because it's those extensibilities and those kind of abilities, if you like, for developers to extend it out and surface some of that information from Viva to users. And it just so happens that the SharePoint framework is like a handy place to do that, and specifically, SharePoint SPFx or SharePoint framework extensions are a good way of doing that. So there's a new blog post out by Vesa Juvonen, and it goes through some of the key capabilities of 1.8 or 1.18, or we shouldn't really say that, should we? But like the 18th iteration of version 1. And there's all sorts of things in here. I just want to kind of focus on some of the screenshots. There's some new layout options for creating Viva connection cards. Look really, really nice. There's some new, specifically to Microsoft Teams as well. There is an update for the Microsoft Teams solution templates. Just some kind of design guidance, alignment stuff. So it's not like major, but just so you know. There's some new stuff. There's a new tutorial for creating a people search adaptive card extension, so that's interesting. Adaptive card extensions are evolving. I think when they first came out, they were relatively basic, and maybe people looked at them a bit and then discarded them. They are getting better and better. They are improving over time, so they're definitely one to watch as well. There's a public preview of something called Bot Framework Powered Viva Cards. This is definitely worth keeping an eye on. They've talked about it before, and it's kind of an interesting way of doing things with Bot Framework and creating, using Bot Framework to then create and power Viva cards. So a little bit different. You can do this as well using adaptive card extensions. I think what there's a notice here, which is kind of interesting, but it's worth reading. I think what they're saying is we are going to keep developing both Bot Framework Powered Viva cards and adaptive card extensions in parallel for the moment, even though it kind of in some ways you could say maybe they're doing similar things. But yeah, if all of that sounds interesting, and if you want to see some of this stuff in action, there's a link to a YouTube video which is demos of all of this stuff on the Microsoft 365 and Power Platform community call, which actually is one of my picks this week. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. So I wanted to call it out here that this is a very specific version or episode, if you like, that demos some of the stuff in this blog post. So new version of that out. If you use it already, you'll know how useful it is. It's worth checking out the updates to see if there's something in there for you. If not, even if you're not a SharePoint developer, and I would challenge you on that actually, because as everything is kind of getting smushed up together, so like I don't think we really have these big boundaries now of Teams developers, SharePoint developers. I think we're all Microsoft 365 developers, and so if you haven't previously looked at SPFx, then it's definitely worth taking a look at that stuff, because I think it meets a specific need, and quite often you might find that the things you're struggling to do with, say, the technology you're very intimate with, and that might be, say, Teams development tooling. You might be trying to do something and actually it's quite hard to do there, but actually it's quite easy to do if you start using SPFx as well. So it's worth considering across the stack what is available. All right, there's a new update for Azure Communication Services because we're into a new month, so we get a whole roll-up of all the feature updates that are new this month. There's some really cool stuff with extensibility with Microsoft Teams and call automation. I've talked about call automation before. It's the ability to have server-side control of making and receiving calls, transferring calls, and everything like that. There's some new stuff with Microsoft Teams now, so that is interesting. Basically, you can have call automation on the back end, so you can have your server-side code answering calls, making calls, and you can then transfer them to Microsoft Teams users. So that's interesting. That's really, really interesting, because you might have subject matter experts using Microsoft Teams, and you've got your front end where it's all in call automation services. you can now bridge those worlds together. So you can transfer a call from Azure Communication Services into Microsoft Teams. So that's really, really interesting. And that is worth taking a look at. And it's in public preview now, so you can build things with it. You just can't go live with them really, or you can go live but you're not supported. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how this works. The devil will be in the details, specifically charging. So I imagine you will continue to be charged per minute for your ACS call that is transferred over to Microsoft Teams. That's just the way it is, I think. But don't forget that when you're doing that, it's very much a one-way charge. So your Teams user that's answering the call it won't be charged. So it's not terrible. It's just something to take into account when building out the solution, is just to understand the charging model. And this is true of all cloud stuff, really, isn't it? When you're building out your solution, it's important to understand the charging model. And I'm the first really to argue that the charging model shouldn't influence the design. You should settle on the most appropriate technical design first, and then just make sure you're happy with the charging. But I also understand the realities of, there might be 2 or 3 different ways of doing something architecturally, and then it does come down often to the pricing, to the scalability, to the reliability, and whatever else it is. So definitely worth taking a look through. There's some other stuff in that update as well. There's some cool stuff around Azure Cognitive Services. I'm going to be talking about some of that actually at a talk next week, so I'm excited about that. Some new Azure Cognitive Services, Azure Communication Services stuff with Azure Cognitive Services for both text-to-speech and speech-to-text. And I will be talking about and demoing both of those things, which is quite exciting. Bunch of other things as well, including continuous DTMF recognition, as well as just fixed, DTMF recognition, which is kind of interesting and very sort of specific if that's your use case. But also there's some PSTN direct geo expansion stuff. There's lots and lots happening in ACS at the moment. Again, there's always lots happening in ACS, which is why these monthly update blog posts are so helpful, because it's really hard often to keep track on all the things that are changing. So that's definitely worth checking out, that blog post. All right. A blog post by Mary Jo Foley on her Directions on Microsoft blog. It's about Copilot, and it's about the copyright commitment that Microsoft have made. And the headline of this blog post is why Microsoft's Copilot copyright commitment may not mean much for customers yet. Now, I'm including this because Microsoft's Copilot copyright commitment was news to me, and I wasn't previously aware of it. And so I wanted to make you aware of it. Basically, like in a real nutshell, customers are worried about copyright or IP infringement claims for stuff that they've generated using Copilot. And so Microsoft have put in this kind of commitment to say that you're covered. I don't know. Like, they're going to, if you're challenged on copyright grounds, we will assume responsibility. Well, that's interesting. So the blog post goes into the detail of that and kind of says, actually, you should be a bit careful about taking that at face value for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it was put in a blog post, not in the actual contract. Secondly, there's some stuff in here. There's some disclaimer clauses in the service agreement. And also thirdly, it depends, you can't break that agreement by including data that you knew to be copyrighted or copyrighted content. So basically Microsoft are saying, we'll indemnify you as long as you don't include copyrighted content, which kind of, I guess. So we'll see. I think the best part of this blog post is, in quotes, copyright is hard. So take a look at the blog post if it's interesting. It's a whole area I hadn't even considered, whether companies will be averse to using Copilot because of IP infringement worries. It must be a big thing because Microsoft have addressed it with a blog post and called it out. So that makes me feel like it is actually quite a big deal for companies. But it wasn't something I was previously aware of. So it's kind of an interesting one. A couple more things just to draw your attention to. I mentioned this before. The Microsoft 365 and Power Platform community do bi-weekly updates for developers. They are on Thursdays at 7 a.m. Pacific, which is 3 p.m. GMT. and they are worth going to. I'm going to put a link to this page, which has got links to all of the different community events that they've got. The one I'm talking about is this one right here. There's links to a calendar item, there's a link to the YouTube channel for it, and also to a Teams meeting. So please go and attend these if you possibly can. They are free to attend. They are open to everybody. They are a great place to stay up to date with everything that's going on. If you don't want to just get your updates from here, that's fine. Yeah, there's other things as well. So if you're particularly into Office add-ins or SharePoint or Power Platform, there's other specific monthly or bi-weekly calls, or even weekly calls for you there as well. And finally, the last thing I want to tell you about is next week I'm going to be speaking at this event, CollabDays, at Bletchley Park in the UK. Very excited for this. It's the first one of the kind of autumn season for me, and it's at an amazing location, Bletchley Park, home of the National Museum of Computing. Huge amount of history, huge amount of very pertinent history to our sort of trade, and so very excited to be there. I'm going to be talking about Teams and Azure Communication Services. I'm actually doing two different sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. I've got different demos for both. I quite like the first demo. Well, I like both demos, but like the first one is new, so I'm kind of excited by it. We're going to be looking at all sorts of ACS things and how it works with Teams, and bringing everyone up to speed with all the stuff that's going on with Azure Communication Services. So that should be lots and lots of fun. All right, that is everything from me. I hope you have a great week, whatever it is you're doing this week. I will speak to you all next time.